Welcome back guys, Jimmy Jules here again with another crate prop tutorial. In today's episode we'll be going over the joint rotator prop. On the right here I've got the joint rotator's settings menu, and then we'll go through some examples with what we can do with this prop after we go through what each setting does. Firstly, it's good to note that you get a bit of a visual representation of what the prop is going to do when we unpause the game. So if I press the 7 key for the unpause shortcut, you can see the joint rotator will rotate one of its axes, and this is indicating what it's going to do to whichever prop or object that it's affecting. You can see at the moment the joint rotator rotates quite slowly. This is determined by the speed setting. This is measured in degrees per second, so at the moment it's going to turn 20 degrees per second. If we increase this to 90 and unpause the game again, you can see the joint rotator rotates much more quickly. We also have our acceleration and deceleration options here, and these determine how many degrees per second the speed will increase per second. So for example, to make this easy, if we change both of these to 90, the joint rotator will take a full second to reach its full rotation speed of 90 degrees per second. If we increase these both to 180, it will take half a second for the joint rotator to reach its maximum speed. You can see the acceleration and deceleration in action. If we unpause the game again, there'll be a slow increase and decrease to the joint rotator's movement. We then have angle 1 and angle 2 options. These of course are going to determine the starting angle and the ending angle of our prop, and these are indicated with the lines coming out of the prop. The green line is our angle 1 and the red line is our angle 2. If we increase angle 2 to 180, so it makes a full half turn, you can see the visual representation has changed to show us that the joint rotator is going to make a full 180 degree rotation. If we unpause the game now, you can see it turns all the way around to the other side. Our joint rotator will activate by default, so it will immediately switch from angle 1 to angle 2 when we start our game. We can then use the switch input on our joint rotator's input page to switch the prop back and forward again with a signal that we have coming from another prop, such as a timer, like we have here. This timer is just resetting itself every 5 seconds, and we're sending a signal to that switch input on the joint rotator to make it switch angle positions. Finally, on the settings menu, we have the target reached pulse output. To demonstrate what this does, I've just got this plugged into a light, so the light will turn on whenever we receive a signal from this port. You can see that once the joint rotator reaches its full rotation and hits either angle 1 or angle 2, the target reached pulse output will activate for a frame. Now that we've been through the settings page, let's go through some examples of what we can do with this prop. First of all, we'll go through the different ways we can affect our objects or props. There are 2 ways we can do this. We can either glue the object to the joint rotator, like we have with this setup here, or we can target the object with the joint rotator, like we have with this setup down here. These will do 2 slightly different things. The center of rotation for the joint rotator that's targeting the object will be the center of the object itself. So you can see here this joint rotator is targeting this box, and if I unpause the game, the center of rotation will be based around the center of this box. You can see with the glued object, however, the center of rotation is the joint rotator itself. This targeted box spins around on its axis, whereas this box spins around the joint rotator as though it's orbiting it. It's important to keep this in mind because depending on what you're trying to do, you'll need to use a different setting. We've got a quick and simple setup here, just as our very first example. And this setup simply has the target reached pulse output looping back into the switch output. With our setup here, we've got our objects glued to the joint rotator, so the center of rotation will be around the joint rotator itself. And every time the target angle is reached, it sends a pulse back to the switch port to make it switch positions again. This way you can have a continuously operating joint rotator without any additional props. To make this from scratch, all we need to do is press the G shortcut over the object and then select the joint rotator. Then from the settings of the joint rotator, we just grab the output from the target reached pulse and plug that into the switch input. And there we have our flappy paddle. You can of course change the speed of this and add some acceleration and deceleration as well. And this will all stay functional. For our next example, we'll go through how to make a door that we can only get through once we've collected a certain amount of currency. For our physical door, I've just got a wall with a gap in it for our door, and I've also got a door sculpt as well. We'll be using an input trigger, a sensor, a joint rotator, two calculators, a selector, and a currency prop. We want our door to work as though it's on a hinge. So for this setup, we're going to be gluing our door primitive to the joint rotator. I'm going to drag the joint rotator to where the hinge of the door would be, so in the very corner, and then I'm going to glue the door primitive to the joint rotator. You can see now with our door glued to the joint rotator, if we unpause the game, that will open the door. Now we'll set up our currency so that this opens the door once that we have 5 coins. We've got our currency prop here, and we're going to plug this into a calculator to check whether our coins, or our diamond currency in this case, is greater than 4. This will mean our currency needs to be 5 or greater. When this is true, I'm going to plug this into port 9 of a 9-port selector. So our selector is going to start on port 1, then when we have 5 coins or more, our selector is going to be set to port 9. We're now going to use our currently selected output and plug this into one last calculator, and we're going to multiply our currently selected output by 10. So you can imagine when our selector is on port 1, that's going to be 1 times 10, which will equal 10. When our selector is on port 9, it's going to be 9 times 10, which will be 90. And now with this number, we're going to plug that into angle 2 of our joint rotator. Now, of course, we just need something to activate our joint rotator. And for this, we're going to use a sensor and an input trigger. We'll plug our sensor's detected output into the power of the input trigger. And this way, the player will be able to press a button to open our door, in this case, the jump button. We'll plug our key pressed output into the switch input on our joint rotator. And now if we jump into play mode, run near the door and press space, you can see the door opens, but because we haven't collected enough currency yet, it's not going to open far enough for us to get through. I've made some pickups here just with a rotator to rotate our coin prop, a sensor to detect when the player is in range to pick up the object, and then a currency modifier to add 1 to our diamond currency, which will unlock our door. This also activates a destroyer to destroy the coin after it's finished. You can see at the moment our door, it does not open far enough, but then once we jump over here and collect 5 coins, and then run back to the door and give it another shot, you can see the door will open fully and we can pass through. We can also use joint rotators to make something like a funnel or a pinball flipper to either push objects or funnel them down a separate path. For this one, we're sending the exact same value into the angle 1 and angle 2 ports to make the flipper rapidly change positions from left, right, and neutral. We have our selector here controlling all of the main parts of this setup. We're again using the currently selected output and a little bit of math to change the angle on our joint rotator. We have our first input trigger here set to the left custom key on the keyboard. So when the player presses left, it's going to set our selector to port 1. When the player presses right, it's going to set our selector to port 3. And when the player is not pressing either of these keys, it's going to set our selector to its neutral state in port 2. To set our selector back to port 2, I've just got both of these input triggers plugged into an OR gate, and then this OR gate plugs into a NOT gate, so we're saying when the player is not pressing either of these buttons, then set our selector back to port 2. So with our main selector set up, with our port 1 for left, port 2 for neutral, and port 3 for right, we can do a little bit of math on our currently selected output to get the numbers that we're after. Now the angles that I need for this setup are -40 for when the flipper is at the left side, 0 for when it's in its neutral position, and +40 for when it's on the right side. So you can see at the moment, the signal being sent to the rotator is 0. When I press left, the signal being sent is -40, and when I press right, the signal is +40. So now the trick is just to get those numbers from our 1, 2, and 3 currently selected output. Firstly, we're going to -1 from our currently selected, so you can now imagine these ports as ports 0, 1, and 2 instead of 1, 2, and 3. Then we're going to take our 0, 1, or 2 output and multiply this by 40. So in this circumstance, we'll get 0 times 40, which will be 0, 1 times 40, which is 40, and 2 times 40, which is 80. We've almost got the numbers that we need here. All we need to do with this number is -40. And that's exactly what our final calculator is doing. We're just taking this value and taking away 40 from it. So now rather than having 0, 40, and 80 as our options from this calculator, we're getting -40, 0, and 40 as the options, which are the exact numbers that we need to control our joint rotator. So as our main selector changes ports, Our calculators are going to modify this number and then send the final results to angle 1 and angle 2 on our joint rotator's input. Just as a bit of an addition, I've made it so that if you send the ball down the right path, it will add a point to your score up the top, and if you send it down the wrong path, it will take a point away. I've just got a couple of colored balls at the top here, which are being spawned by a spawner and a randomizer to randomize which ball is spawned. And there's also a sensor down the bottom of each ramp detecting each type of ball. If a blue ball goes down the blue side, it will add a point, whereas if a red ball goes down that side, it will minus a point, and this will be the opposite for the red side. One final thing we'll go through is how to rotate something on a different axis, and all that we need to do for this is to rotate the joint rotator so that it's pointing on the axis that we want to rotate something. So you can see that we've rotated these joint rotators 90 degrees, and they're instead turning this object on a different axis compared to the ones that we've got flat on the ground. This final setup is a bit more of a simple one, so we've just got our 2 joint rotators, and we've got both halves of the box of our lid glued to a separate joint rotator. These joint rotators are where the hinge for the box would be, so that the doors open outwards. We've also got a sensor in front of this box to activate the joint rotators, and we've got a couple of lights as well, just to make it a bit more fancy. So you can see we've got our little gift box here, and as we run up to it, it's going to light up and pulse a bit, and the box will open. You can imagine that you would have something cool in there, maybe a weapon or whatever you like, something you've created by yourself, totally up to you. Anyway guys, that's just about all the examples that we have today for the joint rotator. If you have any questions or just have something to say, definitely leave a comment. This has been Jimmy Jules, and I'll see you in the next one.